So I guess we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to acceptance testing strategies. I'm Frances Litt. I work at Coldfront Labs, and I work on testing the software that we build and also automating tests and workflows. Another thing about me is that I really enjoy testing, and I'm hoping to share some of that enthusiasm with you today. This talk is pretty much focused on some ideas and tools that I've found really useful in the work that I do, and I'm hoping that when you leave, you'll be able to maybe take some of these ideas with you and apply them in the work that you do. Some of these things, some of these concepts I've adapted to my own purposes, and of course you would need to do the same, but it's just mainly to give you an idea of what's out there and available and how you can maybe focus your tests a little bit better and plan your testing efforts for acceptance testing. So we'll start with a definition. Everyone starts with definitions, but basically, according to the International Software Testing Qualifications Board, acceptance testing is the type of testing where you're testing with respect to users' needs, right? The requirements and the business processes that are conducted to determine whether or not a system satisfies the requirements that it was set out to do. This testing could be done by users, customers, or other authorized entities, think software testers like myself, to determine whether or not to accept the system. So generally, someone like me would perform alpha testing. You're testing the code internally as part of the software development team to make sure that the requirements have been met. And then the end user acceptance testing would be done at a different point, which is also known as beta testing, where again you're evaluating the software to make sure that it is acceptable and meets the requirements that it was set out to meet. Acceptance testing can go by a variety of names. Sometimes people just call it functional testing, customer testing, story tests. But really, I like the term acceptance test because this type of testing should incorporate more than just making sure that the software does exactly what you think it should do. You also have to think about all of the other aspects that influence how the user is perceiving the software or the system as a whole, and that their experience is great regardless of whether you get 2 when you add 1 plus 1. You want more than just function when you're looking at accepting a feature. So in today's talk, we're going to go over planning acceptance tests and when you should kind of think about running acceptance tests in the development process, how to design a good test plan and test cases, as well as some tips and tools that I found helpful in the work that I do for ensuring test coverage and applicability. So let's start by looking at planning. A couple of questions we'll look at today. When should I plan to do acceptance testing? How can I plan for acceptance testing? And also, who should be involved in determining the types of tests that are run? So in diagrams of the different types of testing that are done in software development, often acceptance tests are shown as like the last tier of testing. You'll run your unit tests, your kind of system tests, your basic functional tests, and then this acceptance testing often gets shoved to the end. And this is fine because you do have to wait for features to exist before you can test. But what you sometimes see is that acceptance tests are deferred to like the end of the project to actually test the system that's being developed. And you really don't actually want to do that because by the time you're because this involves taking into account the user's perspective, you do want to make sure that throughout the development process, you're always evaluating if what you're building is meeting the needs of the user. So you don't only want to be testing small bits, but you also want to be looking at the system as it's being developed and evaluating it continuously. So I guess the first takeaway is make sure that you're building acceptance testing into your development process. if you do this, you can actually make your acceptance testing part of your definition of done for a feature. So not only have you written unit tests when you've written something, but you've also had someone evaluate it from the perspective of the user and considered the aspects that are important for making sure that the feature that was developed is actually good as a whole in the system and fits well into the system. So quickly, I guess I just wanted to talk about if you decide to do this, you actually kind of need to think about it a little, right? So there are going to be a bunch of questions that you need to answer. And this is making a plan, but I don't mean like a 100-page document. I mean just answering the question of like, who is responsible for doing this type of testing? When will they be involved, and when do they come in and run the tests? What kind of infrastructure needs to be set up to run your acceptance testing to make sure that it's available when you need it? And how will testing be done? Are you going to run your acceptance tests manually? Are they going to be automated? These types of issues. So by planning ahead, you'll know when testing needs to be done, who will be involved, and that infrastructure is ready to go when you need it. So I mentioned, I'm just going to take a drink here because I'm really thirsty. Apparently it's very dry in this room. I mentioned that there are multiple things to consider with acceptance testing. And so these are a few of the additional things. There's not only functionality, but you want to make sure that the user experiences the system as a whole in a great way. So it needs to be accessible, it needs to be secure, it needs to be performant. These are considerations that should be taken into account. In a minute I'm going to talk about requirements for a system. These need to be taken into account when you're specifying the requirements for your system and for your features, because these items need to be thought of throughout the development process. Okay, so when you're writing your acceptance criteria, and let me step back here a minute. Once you've outlined that test plan or how you're going to do testing, you need to determine the specifics of things that you're going to test. And the way that you would do this, in agile development at least, is when you're listing your features or your user stories, you use acceptance criteria to turn those user stories into a set of requirements. So your acceptance criteria, it's the list of requirements that need to be fulfilled in order to complete that user story or fulfill the user story. So acceptance criteria define what is expected of a feature before it's built and provide the information about the exact requirements that are necessary. They're the specification for the system that you're building. Developers use these requirements to create the software solution, and then testers, this is where this talk comes in, you're going to look at those acceptance criteria and develop a set of acceptance tests based on those criteria. To write good acceptance criteria, the most important thing is to make sure that the criteria actually accurately represent what needs to be built. This seems very obvious, but it's often there's a disconnect between the customer or the client who's looking for the software system to be built and the team who actually writes the requirements down that need to be fulfilled. Sometimes the development team is working in isolation on these things, but it's really important to make sure that that if you're working on your individual feature descriptions, that you pull in and get review and input from the client or users to inform the acceptance criteria and make sure that they accurately represent what is desired. To make sure that acceptance criteria can be understood by everyone, your requirements in your sorry, I'm very GitLab focused, so I want to say issues all the time because issues are the levels in which we define our work to be done. But the requirements that you list should be not overly technical. You should be able to list things in a way that anyone can read it and understand what is required. And finally, acceptance criteria needs to be measurable. This makes it possible to translate a criteria into one or more acceptance tests. And so it should be obvious to anyone on the project when they look at the criteria whether or not the software will pass or fail given a certain result when you're using it. So when writing acceptance criteria, remember to address not just functionality, but all of those other considerations we talked about on the previous slide, such as performance, accessibility, security, data integrity, documentation. These are all issues that will affect the way that users perceive the software, and that should be considered when you're testing the software for acceptance. So for example, consider a case where you've been asked to write a report. The user story, in this case, as a manager, I would like to view a report of user activity. This user story is giving you a general idea of what is required, but you need more specifics in order to develop and test the feature. So this is where acceptance criteria come in. Information about the type of data that should be displayed, as well as how the data should be displayed, would be included in the criteria. Again, when we're talking about acceptance criteria, I already mentioned needing input from various people. And actually, it's not only the fact that you want input from clients and end users, but you need a variety of input from various parties. So as we mentioned, end users often have perspectives that are unique to their roles and experience. Their knowledge of the subject matter and the processes that are involved make them able to provide the criteria for the functional requirements of the system. But and the example earlier with the manager providing the information that's required in the report is an example of that. But while end users are able to provide information regarding their needs and expectations, software developers may be better suited to identifying considerations that are less tangible, such as accessibility concerns, security, and performance. Though they may not know what data is needed in a report, for example, they can easily determine how the report should be accessed, maybe, and the formats that should be available to end users. This type of input also should be documented in that acceptance criteria. So thinking about the different voices and perspectives that are involved in development makes me think about the concept of white box versus black box testing. In black box testing, the tester doesn't know anything about the system necessarily. They're just seeing it from the front end. Testing is done regardless of how this system is designed or implemented. Whereas in white box testing, the tester is aware of how the system is structured and implemented, and generally can tailor tests based on how the system was implemented. Sometimes this is called clear box testing because you can see into the system and know how it works. So I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but if you think about black box and white box and how they're used, and then the different types of expertise we've been talking about, and the different people involved in a project, where would these people fit? Where would a client or end user fit? Would they be seeing the system and knowing how it works necessarily, or would they be more on the black box side of things?
Black box.
Of course, yeah. On the other hand, developers and in some cases software testers know more about the system, and so they're approaching it from the inside out almost. They know how it works. So the reason I'm mentioning this is that it's important to consider information from both the black box perspective and the white box perspective when writing acceptance tests. Your acceptance criteria should spell out both the obvious and end user expectations, as well as the less obvious requirements of the system. I would also argue that it's important to channel these different perspectives when testing the software. For example, if you know how the software works, if you're a white box tester, and have intimate knowledge of the system you're testing, your familiarity with how it works might just stop from trying things that less informed users would do naturally. You might just not think of it. On the other hand, users who are completely unfamiliar with a system may not know how to pinpoint the parts of the system that are fragile, so they might not know how to test those areas appropriately. All this to say that it's important to consider various perspectives and the expertise of various individuals when documenting acceptance criteria, so that these are translated properly into well-rounded acceptance tests. Bear with me a minute here. So for that example of the user activity report from earlier, presumably we consulted with a manager in this case, it's very vague, to gather their input on the information that was required in the report and how they would like to see it. But these managers did not necessarily have a strong understanding of how the system works, but they were able to tell you the things that impacted them and their experience. On the other hand, you might need input from someone more familiar with the system and maybe the organization's processes, such as a site admin, to identify the user roles that should have access to this type of report. So to recap on planning, we've talked about the importance of incorporating acceptance tests into the development cycle, considering more than just basic functionality in your acceptance testing, how to write acceptance criteria and the value of acceptance criteria for your acceptance testing efforts, as well as the importance of consulting with various people to compile your requirements or acceptance criteria. So next up, we're going to jump into test design. Given a goal, people will generally try to find the most straightforward way to accomplish it. Right? It's just natural. You try to save yourself effort. In software testing, when you verify that the software does exactly what is meant, or it is meant to do by following the expected behavior, this is called positive or happy path testing. A positive test is considered a pass if you get the right output for that set of steps, or it's considered a fail if you get the wrong output. It's important when designing and executing acceptance tests to keep in mind that testing needs to do more than simply verify that the software works. In most cases, I'd almost guarantee that the developer who wrote the software tried the happy path to verify the work. It's also important to validate that the user's experience for the feature is great regardless of whether or not they follow the expected steps to that end goal. So this is where negative testing comes in. Whereas positive tests check that the system works as expected, negative tests ensure that the system can handle invalid inputs and unexpected behavior. In feature acceptance tests, negative tests are very important. This is because users, like I said, don't know necessarily how they're expected to use the software. And so negative tests are used to grill the software, ask it some hard questions, give it tough material, make sure that the user is always guided towards the way that they are meant to use the software without hitting any walls. Considering negative tests should start when you're writing the acceptance criteria. Include information about what is expected when the user enters incorrect or invalid information. And there might be more negative tests than positive tests for a feature. You might there might be many ways that a user could run into problems when trying to get through a workflow. So you might think that a user would read the requirements of a system and follow the steps exactly, but more likely they're going to end up running or trying things out and then not understanding why it didn't work. So that's why it's important to run these tests up front. Don't look too closely at my expected behavior here. I didn't have room to have explicit error messages or anything listed out, but normally I would say that you should have explicit messages or ways of handling unexpected behavior that really guide the user towards a better result. This is another one that might seem obvious, is attention to detail. It's really important when you're running tests to not only verify that the software does something, but that it does the right thing, right? Very obvious. Problem is, I've seen a lot of people test by just entering random information into a form and then checking that like something happened. I'm going to say it's much more valuable if you actually pay attention to the inputs that you're putting into the system. Because what this allows you to do is check that the outputs are correct. And now, a lot of this type of testing, of course, belongs at the unit test level and at the functional test level. But it's important, especially in alpha or the first acceptance tests that are being done, to verify that the system was actually is actually doing what the end user expects or what the client expects it to do. Because it's possible that in those acceptance criteria that were written, if they weren't verified properly, there could be a disjoint between what the developer understood was required and what the client understood was being made. And so it's very important to make sure that you do at some point validate that the requirement or that what is being expected as a user actually is being spit out by the system. And you do this by paying attention to exactly the inputs that you're feeding or the workflows that you're following, and then paying attention to the results that you're getting out. Incorporating attention to detail into your tests makes sure that you're not only testing that the software does something, but that you're validating that it is in fact doing the right thing. Quality over quantity. So keep in mind when running acceptance tests, it doesn't matter how many tests you write or you do. You don't need 20 happy path tests. In fact, maintaining a large number of tests can be a waste of time and energy. What's important is that you focus on writing quality tests, and that helps you make the most of your testing time, making sure you design tests that are detailed and specific in listing or knowing the expected inputs, outputs, and the behavior of the system. These are the types of tests that are worth running and rerunning. So that covers up our test design. We talked about doing more than just verifying things, that you actually want to kind of grill the software a little bit. Doing so using negative tests and how they're valuable, and the importance of attention to detail in your testing. All right, so for some tips and tools, something I found is that it's sometimes a lot easier to document and track acceptance criteria in a table or a grid format. This is just one of these little tips or tools that I use. You can use matrices to simplify the communication of complex sets of requirements and to ensure that all aspects of a feature are being tested. There are many different types of matrices used in test planning and execution, and we're going to look at one simple example that I use. So this matrix is showing the expected behavior for user roles related to creating, editing, and viewing a schedule. By looking at this matrix, it's easy to determine the various scenarios that need to be tested for each role, and to determine the expected result for each of those situations. Information like this is much easier to convey in a table than in separate lines of text. So when you have a complex set of related requirements, making a matrix might be the simplest way to communicate that information in your acceptance criteria. In addition to creating matrices like the one shown here, I often use a matrix to track my operating system browser combinations to make sure I've filled in or checked all the possible combinations that I should. And generally, I find this a very useful tool as well to like make sure that I've tested all the possible combinations in terms of complex features. This brings us next up is strategic testing. You can't test everything. That's just a fact. What you can do, though, is approach testing a feature strategically. So the example I'm going to use today to illustrate this is more aimed at functional testing. But the point is that if you think about your testing and apply, just apply a bit of thought and careful analysis into how you're running your tests, you'll be able to run more targeted tests that are much more effective than if you were testing randomly or just trying to hit all of the use cases. The example I've chosen today is using the combination of equivalence class partitioning and boundary value analysis to determine what should be tested. So it sounds fancy, but you probably actually do equivalence class partitioning all the time. In this methodology, you divide up the possible inputs and create a set of groupings that group like inputs. So given this requirement, where a username must be between 5 and 10 characters, how would you test that this has been implemented correctly? Would you test every single possible number of characters for a username? No, of course not, right? No, you'd group these into 3 distinct ranges probably, and these are considered your equivalence classes. So a username that's 4 characters or less, all the 4 characters or less, that's one group of potential tests. The next partition would be the 5 to 10 characters, and the next partition would be more than 10 characters. So, I mean, easy to determine these partitions. So when deciding what to test, you'd likely divide this requirement into these 3 partitions. Here's a diagram of that. And then you can use boundary value analysis, which is testing focused on the boundaries between equivalence partitions, to target your tests. So the idea here being that defects are more likely to exist at the boundaries of equivalence partitions than in the middle of the partitions. So given the partitions we identified earlier, what tests would you execute when testing the username criteria? So the first test that I would run is 4 characters and make sure that that's not allowed, because that's right at the edge of the distinction that's being made in terms of what allowable behavior. The next test I would run would be the 5 characters and make sure that that's allowed. And then again, you test at the next boundary, which would be the 10 and 11 characters. Keep in mind, I'm not really saying that you would have to like document partitions and analyze boundaries when you're writing tests. These are more just concepts to keep in mind when you're running through tests to determine how to target your testing efforts. So we've talked a lot about test planning and test design, but what about ad hoc testing? There is huge value in stepping back from the requirements and just using the software. With an open mind, it helps you channel the user in terms of knowing or seeing the software with fresh eyes and not getting caught up in all of the all of the information that's thrown at you with making sure that acceptance criteria are met and all of this, but just experiencing the software and being able to evaluate it with a fresh perspective. Finally, a note on test automation. Automated tests are great, especially if you use continuous integration and development or deployment. You can just sit back, relax, and watch the software build, test, and deploy itself, right? Oh, someone knows I'm being sarcastic. Okay, so no, that's not always the case, or it's generally not the case. Writing and maintaining automated tests is a real investment of time and can be unrewarding if it's not done carefully. I do know. So, thoughts on automated testing. Automate selectively. For one thing, acceptance tests are not the best place to start. Generally, you want to really focus your automating efforts on unit tests or very simple functional tests, because this lowers the amount of maintenance that's going to have to be done, because you're touching less things in each test, right? If you do choose to automate acceptance tests, and there are good reasons to do this, select specific workflows that represent critical functionality in the software and automate those first. That way you can implement a few tests, know what the value of running those tests is, and then see how much time you spend maintaining them before you choose to automate more. So you'll know if it's worth your investment. Also, timing is important. You certainly would not want to write automated acceptance tests for features that are in flux, because all that's doing is meaning that you're going to end up writing those tests again. If workflows or the design is changing, hold off on automating those tests and wait until they're in a better state. Finally, use the right tools for the job. For example, I speak from personal experience here, don't use screen capture tests if the page content is subject to change. Use tools like JMeter for load and performance testing. Do your research, find out what tool is best suited for a particular purpose and implement that. I've been recently using Codeception for acceptance tests and finding it to be a very useful tool. All right. So that pretty much covers up the tips and tools that I had for you. I know we covered a lot of varying material, but I'm hoping that some of these ideas will stick with you and give you ideas that you can take back to your own work. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just wondering, for your boundary tests, do you do all of them as best practice, or do you just do some of them for strategic efficiency?
I mean, I guess it would depend on, like, if you're automating boundary tests, like if it's easy for you to automate them, and I guess it depends on, it would depend on the circumstances, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, it depends how many boundaries there are, and if, like, what it matters. Like, in some ways, this is where I'd say white box testing, or, the white box comes into play, because if a developer can tell you that this is calculated the same way every time it's done, there would be no need in repeating that test. But if it's specific logic that's defining these things differently, then yes, you would want to be able to test those separately. But there's also the idea that you could, if you could automate it to just run through, then it would be a lot less of a headache and probably worthwhile. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes?
So I don't know how relevant my question is to your presentation.
That's okay.
So what is the importance of cross-browser testing these days when we have a lot of modern browsers coming up? And
Do you need IE support?
Yeah, and sometimes also.
That's my answer.
Just stop paying attention to IE because.
Just to make a point here, This is a good boundary. Like, do you need IE or not?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there is value in cross-browser testing because I've seen differences between browsers. So I guess I would have to say there's value. Yep.
I can answer that question.
There we go.
So Firefox, Chrome, and Safari all render things very slightly differently. So especially with Chrome, because Chrome, all the Google devs implement all these new features constantly, and sometimes it's a few weeks, months, year plus until the latest version of Safari and Firefox implement those new features. So different browser testing is important, maybe not for everything, but especially when you're dealing with some of the cutting edge, this is the newest stuff. Typically Chrome supports it, and everything else takes a while.
Best
Good
case
answer.
Chrome and worst case Internet Explorer. If it works for all, then it's good.
That's optimistic.
You might want to check in between there.
I do want to ask, what could be good candidates for automated testing? I know that there is not value in investing time in automating all acceptance testing criteria, but are there any good candidates where you say, okay, maybe probably it's a good idea to just automate that?
I think it depends. It really depends on what features are the most valuable to your automated acceptance tests are going to end up being regression tests, right? You're going to want to run them when you make changes to make sure that nothing is broken. So if you have key workflows that test I mean, I hate to say that tests a variety of things, but in some ways there's a lot of value in one test that touches a bunch of things and knowing that it works, and that's like a workflow test. But I mean, a lot of people would argue with that because then you're getting into maintaining a test that is kind of ridiculous, right? So again, if you're testing individual components, that's probably better. But then these UI tests or tests on the front end, yeah, I would say you'd have to consult with someone who knows what's crucial in the system and design maybe common workflow tests and automate those, which is that's something that we've done is ask the client to identify the 4 or 5 most important workflows that need to work and that touch a bunch of things that have broken in the past, and then they're able to tell us and we automate those. Anything else? All right, thank you so much.